In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. This is the second week of, in fact, your presentation for Chomsky's Universal Grammar as the course for linguistics in language teaching. Okay, I am going to review, in fact, table or figure 1.1 on page 4. Okay, last week we talked about in fact the developments in Chomsky's idea of language, in fact understanding of the nature of all human language, okay, which we called it something like which we called things like Chomsky's universal grammar, etc., as we are going to follow. So the first model, as you see, appears on page 4, and it is called Transformational Generative Grammar. Sometimes it is called Generative Transformational Grammar. Sometimes Transformational Generative Grammar. Sometimes Generative Transformational Grammar, no difference. Okay, so it is something like TG or GT, no difference. Okay, which appeared on 1957, and the key terms are, as you see, to the right, and the key books are to the right of this. Okay, again to the right, the rightmost. Chomsky, about 7 years after that, or 8 years after that, in 1965 actually, developed his idea of transformational generative grammar as a form of something called a book called, as I told you in the previous week, that it was called Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. If you go to the end of this book, and you find Chomsky 1965 on the references at the end of this book. Okay, I don't want you to go there. I am going to use my hard book to say which page I mean, and you're going to find it later on. Page 311 of this book. Okay, we have references, the second page of the references, which is 311. There you can find this book, Chomsky N. 1965, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, Cambridge, Massachusetts, MIT Press. Okay, Cambridge, Massachusetts, MIT Press. It's out there. Okay, you are going to find it on page 311. So, Chomsky here with 1965, and the name of the book is, as I told you, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, actually gave a kind of good understanding of the nature of language at that time. Okay, 1965. Well, in about 1970s, etc., there were extensions to the 1965 version. Okay, 1965 version of the theory of Chomsky. Okay, which we called it as extended standard theory. Why? Because in 1965 we have the standard theory of Chomsky. Okay, Chomsky called it the standard theory. Okay, in 1970s, okay, he actually developed his ideas about actually changed his 1965 model in order to make it better and better. Okay? Anyway, it was about 1981 and years after that Chomsky developed a good model which is called government binding theory. Everything we want to say is about this kind of model, government binding model. Of course, it is about 1981. Okay, sometimes they say that Chomsky's model is, when they say Chomsky's model, they mean the developments at this time of year 1981. Okay. And there are different kinds of books written, but there's the name, well, Chomsky 81, yes. There is a kind of, let me in fact check it, 1981A, Lectures on Government and Binding. It is the continuation of the previous model of Chomsky, and the name of the book, as you see, is Lectures on Government and Binding, and this is the original Chomsky's model of language. Okay, we are going to understand this kind of thing. As you see, we have on the key terms in this area, we have something like principles, parameters, D-structure, surface structure, and movement. And one important thing is that universal grammar. I'm going to talk about it today. Okay? So, remember, when we talk about Chomsky's ideas of language, the biggest part belongs to 1981 on. From 1981 on. Okay? Up to the present time. When we say universal grammar, etc., etc. We are going to talk about these things as soon as possible. Okay, now, after that, at the end of the 20th century, actually, he developed ideas in post-1990s, okay, after 1991, etc., up to the present time. Chomsky goes to say, well, the standard model is in fact good, but we are going to have modifications, changes in it from 1990s up to the present time, which is called Minimalist Program. Okay? Minimalist Program. Well, what we are going to talk about in this book is partially belongs to, in fact, the Minimalist Program and a combination that we had on 1981 as government and binding. But for language teachers, it's good to say that the government binding model and the universal grammar is the best that the language teachers can have. Later developments, especially Minimalist Program and post-1990s, are important, but not to the language teacher, because they go their own way. Language teachers go their own way, and in fact, linguists, continue to go their own way. Why? Because the language teachers are, in fact, concerned about teaching. They are concerned about a bigger subject, language. They want to understand the nature of language. But when everything is okay, they send it to language teaching. So we are not working with the theories. We are working with the practice of teaching. So we want to understand the good points of Chomsky's ideas of language in order for us to teach, to work, to study language, okay, which is your main, in fact, idea. So this is a review of what we had on my previous lecture about figure 1.1. But there's one important thing. What is universal grammar? I'm going to talk about it in the next presentation. Just now, just listen to the next presentation before we go to relating sounds and meaning on page 4.